When a multi-million-dollar kidnapping scene is compromised, not by a tactical mastermind, but police tape, and step directly into a space where a masked predator had recently stood. Every single minute that passed without her specialized daily medication pushed her closer to a critical medical emergency. The police needed a solid lead, and they needed it immediately. They began looking for any digital footprint that might explain how an elderly woman could be evaporated from her own home. What they ultimately found buried in the server data of her smart home devices would completely rewrite the timeline of the night and introduce a level of calculated malice that no one could have possibly anticipated. The most horrifying revelations in modern true crime do not always come from a bloody weapon or a coerced confession. Sometimes they emerge from the silent digital logs of our everyday connected devices. When investigators finally cracked into the data stream of the home network, they discovered a timeline that completely shattered any theory of a fast smash and grab kidnapping. The digital footprint revealed a terrifying 43-minute window of absolute calculated darkness. Every single step that driver took potentially crushed microscopic trace evidence deep into the carpet and introduced foreign biological material to the once pristine floorboards. According to verified records, the exterior security ring camera guarding the property was deliberately disabled at exactly 1:45 in the morning. This was not a random power surge or a convenient Wi-Fi drop. It was a manual, targeted intervention. The eyes of the house were intentionally blinded by someone who knew exactly where the lens was pointing. But the true horror lies in the second digital timestamp. The medical pacemaker implanted inside Nancy Guthrie continued to transmit its steady, life-saving data to a mobile monitoring application long after the camera went dead. That internal biological signal did not suddenly vanish from the digital grid until exactly 2:28 in the morning. The math is simple, but the implications are absolutely paralyzing. There is a 43-minute gap between the moment the security camera was killed and the moment the pacemaker lost its connection to the outside world. For nearly 3/4 of an hour, the intruder was inside that house with an 84-year-old woman. What happened during those 43 agonizing minutes? The sterile environment required to build a solid prosecution was completely shattered in an instant. Did the attacker spend that time violently interrogating her in the dark? Were they systematically securing the perimeter from the inside before initiating the transport phase of their plan? The sheer confidence required to linger inside a target location for almost an hour while committing a major federal felony is staggering. It proves the attacker was entirely unconcerned about the police showing up or neighbors hearing a struggle. This level of brazen certainty strongly suggests the perpetrator possessed intimate insider knowledge of the surrounding response times and the exact layout of the property. The chilling nature of this timeline was further amplified on February 10th when the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially stepped in and released a crucial piece of evidence to the public. They released a frozen image captured just before the camera was neutralized. The photograph showed an unidentified male suspect approaching the target residence. He was not a local neighborhood teenager looking for loose cash. This is not just a minor procedural oversight by a rookie cop. The image revealed a man standing roughly 5 feet 9 inches tall, wearing a heavy ski mask to completely obscure his facial features. But the most alarming details were the items he carried with him. The masked suspect was visibly armed and carried a very specific 25-liter Ozark Trail hiking backpack. This was a man fully equipped for a tactical siege. He brought a weapon to confront a frail woman who relied on a pacemaker. He brought a large capacity backpack, indicating he intended to carry out specialized gear or perhaps use it to conceal items taken directly from the home. The photograph proves beyond any doubt that this was a highly premeditated operation. The masked figure studied the camera, found its blind spot, and shut down the digital perimeter before spending 43 terrifying minutes inside the house. The authorities had visual proof of a highly dangerous tactical intruder. But despite having this crucial timeline and a clear photograph of the suspect's gear, the local investigation seemed to be looking in all the wrong directions. This is a catastrophic failure that hands any future defense attorney the ultimate legal weapon of reasonable doubt. The enemy had clearly studied the victim with terrifying precision, but the local authorities were about to stumble into a series of baffling decisions. If an armed man spent 43 minutes inside a home, who do you think he was communicating with on the outside? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the next phase of this investigation will make you question the competence of everyone wearing a badge in that county. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation releases a photograph of an armed masked suspect, you expect the local law enforcement apparatus to immediately lock down the community and execute a flawless coordinated manhunt. You expect the local sheriff to utilize every available resource to hunt down the predator who dared to execute a tactical home invasion in their jurisdiction. The pressure on Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos was immense and immediate. The abduction of an 84-year-old woman who happens to be the mother of a famous national television anchor instantly transformed a local Arizona mystery into a massive national media spectacle. News vans descended on the quiet streets and reporters demanded hourly updates from the local command center. It forces the public to look directly at the officials holding the badges and wonder how something so fundamentally wrong could happen on their specific watch. The entire country was watching closely to see how this department would handle a high-stakes crisis involving a highly vulnerable victim. But instead of witnessing a masterclass in forensic procedure and swift justice, the public was about to watch a local law enforcement agency completely unravel under the intense heat of the national spotlight. The true test of any police department is how they manage the golden hours of an investigation. Those first few days are critical for securing physical evidence, locking down alibis, and aggressively pursuing the most logical suspects before they have a chance to flee or destroy vital digital trails. The discovery of the 43-minute gap and the masked intruder should have immediately directed the focus toward individuals who possessed intimate insider knowledge of the home. Common investigative sense dictates that you vigorously interrogate anyone who had recent unrestricted access to the property. You pull the phone records of the temporary workers. You check their financial histories, and you demand airtight alibis for the early morning hours of February 1st, when the individuals sworn to protect the delicate physical evidence are the ones actively, but the actions taken by the command structure under Sheriff Nanos seem to completely defy this basic logic. Instead of executing a rapid, aggressive dragnet focused on the inner circle of access, The investigation appeared to flounder in a state of baffling hesitation. They were dealing with a ruthless syndicate that had allegedly demanded a massive multi-million-dollar ransom to be paid entirely in untraceable Bitcoin. This sophisticated cryptocurrency extortion plot proved they were hunting a highly organized network, not a lone amateur. Yet the local response felt remarkably sluggish and disorganized. The department seemed entirely overwhelmed by the complex digital nature of the ransom and the intense media scrutiny. The public began to notice the glaring lack of immediate arrests or even named persons of interest. Days turned into a full week, and the silence from the sheriff department became deafening. The narrative began to shift rapidly. The community was no longer just terrified of the masked man in the FBI photograph. They were becoming deeply angry at the people in charge of finding him. Contributing to its destruction, the entire foundation of the local justice system begins to crumble. When a police department fails to act decisively in the face of $1 million crypto ransom, citizens naturally begin to ask dangerous questions. Is the department simply incompetent and out of its depth, or is there a deliberate reason why the most obvious leads are seemingly being ignored by the top brass? The rumors began to swirl through the local community and across the internet. People started whispering about intentional delays and systemic cover-ups. Why was a sophisticated extortion ring able to operate so freely within the county borders? Why was the local command structure failing to execute basic investigative protocols? The frustration reached a boiling point as the family of the victim continued to suffer through the agonizing silence of the kidnappers. The authorities were essentially paralyzed. They had the digital timeline showing the exact moment the pacemaker lost connection, and they had the visual evidence of the heavily armed intruder. But they lacked the structural competence to connect those dots into a coherent, aggressive pursuit. We are diving deep into a baffling abduction that has paralyzed an entire Arizona community and exposed the terrifying vulnerabilities hiding within local law enforcement protocols. The failure to rapidly close the net around the potential inside sources allowed the trail to grow dangerously cold. The masterminds behind the Bitcoin demand were given the greatest gift any criminal could ever ask for. They were given the gift of time. Time to launder the digital currency, time to dispose of the physical evidence, and time to completely vanish. The sheer inability of the local department to mount a competent offensive strategy during those critical early days set the stage for one of the most enraging procedural disasters in modern true crime history. But the hesitation to interview logical suspects was only the beginning of the nightmare. The true depth of the systemic failure was about to be exposed by a single unbelievable incident that would permanently destroy the integrity of the physical crime scene. When a physical location is secured by law enforcement, it is supposed to become a hermetically sealed vault of information. Every single fiber of carpet, every microscopic drop of biological fluid, and every scuff mark on a door frame represents a potential ticket to a conviction. Do you believe this compromised crime scene was just a tragically botched response, or is something much darker being hidden inside Pima County? The fundamental rule of criminal prosecution dictates that these elements must be collected, documented, and preserved without a single shadow of a doubt. But what happens when that sacred perimeter is breached by sheer negligence? The moment an unauthorized civilian crosses a police line, the entire legal foundation of the case shatters. It does not matter if the federal authorities eventually capture a suspect holding a smoking gun. If the original crime scene was treated like a public crosswalk, any competent defense attorney will immediately file motions to suppress every piece of forensic evidence gathered from that property. They will argue that the environment was hopelessly contaminated by outside actors. They will present the jury with the undeniable fact that the initial responders failed to maintain a sterile grid. This legal concept is known as reasonable doubt, and in the realm of high-stakes criminal trials, it is an absolute death blow to the prosecution. The sheer gravity of this procedural disaster forced the local department into a corner. By a civilian delivering a warm pizza, you have to stop and ask a truly terrifying question. Let me know your initial theories down below, and make sure you subscribe to Seth Crime Stories, as the physical domain had been permanently compromised by their own inability to maintain a strict boundary. They could no longer rely on the silent testimony of the house itself. The forensic technicians were essentially rendered useless by the actions of the patrol officers and commanders who failed to secure the perimeter. This catastrophic error meant that the investigative strategy had to pivot abruptly. If the microscopic evidence was tainted, the detectives had no choice but to rely entirely on human intelligence. They had to look away from the floorboards and start looking directly at the individuals who had intimate knowledge of the property. The shift from physical evidence gathering to aggressive witness interrogation is a standard pivot in complex cases. But in a scenario where a massive digital ransom is looming and a victim is missing every second wasted on a ruined crime scene, is a tragedy. The local authorities found themselves desperately playing catch up. They needed to immediately identify and question every single person who had been inside that residence in the months leading up to the abduction. We continue to shine a relentless light on the truth they desperately want to keep buried forever. They needed to find the source of the leak. The perpetrator who executed this flawless extraction clearly possessed a detailed mental map of the interior. They navigated the blind spots and executed their plan with terrifying precision. That kind of operational intelligence is rarely gathered from the street. It is usually purchased, stolen, or freely given by someone who has walked those very halls. The mandate for the detectives was crystal clear. They needed to haul in the individuals who had unrestricted access to the architectural layout. They needed to apply intense, relentless pressure on anyone who could have mapped the vulnerability of the target. The community watched with bated breath, expecting a swift and decisive wave of interrogations. They expected the command structure to redeem their earlier blunders by executing a flawless dragnet of the known associates and temporary laborers. We will not look away from the verified facts, no matter how uncomfortable they make the authorities who are currently handling this open investigation. The logic was inescapable. The physical clues were ruined, so the human clues had to be squeezed until the truth spilled out. If you find yourself infuriated by the sheer lack of basic procedural competence shown so far, make sure you share this video. because the next revelation is going to push that anger to an absolute breaking point. The public assumed that the local department was working around the clock, pulling individuals into stark interrogation rooms and cross-referencing their alibis against the digital logs. They assumed that the heat was being turned up on the most likely sources of the leak. But the reality playing out behind the closed doors of the precinct was vastly different. The urgency that should have driven the witness phase of the investigation was mysteriously absent. The pivot from a botched physical scene to a rigorous human inquiry was the last remaining hope for a rapid resolution. It was the only pathway left to uncover the mastermind behind the sophisticated extortion plot. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, the anticipated wave of aggressive questioning never materialized. To understand how a predator could execute such a flawless extraction, we have to look at the invisible boundaries of Nancy Guthrie in her daily life. The silence from the authorities became a heavy, suffocating blanket over the entire town. The transition from a contaminated physical environment to a seemingly paralyzed interrogation strategy set the stage for the most baffling and destructive delay in the entire history of this case. The detectives knew exactly who they needed to talk to, but for reasons that continue to defy all rational explanation, those conversations simply did not happen. The concept of the golden 48 hours is not just a dramatic television trope. It is a foundational principle of modern criminal investigation. In the immediate aftermath of a violent abduction, witness memories or fresh alibis are rigid, and digital trails have not yet been overwritten or encrypted. When you are dealing with a victim whose survival depends entirely on specialized care, the clock is not just ticking, it is screaming. The most obvious and pressing line of inquiry was staring the local command structure right in the face. A crew of temporary workers had spent weeks inside the residence learning the exact layout and observing the profound vulnerabilities of the homeowner. An 84-year-old woman living alone presents a highly specific profile of extreme physical vulnerability. They were the absolute most logical starting point for any detective worth their badge. But incredibly, the local law enforcement agency allowed an entire month to pass without initiating formal, rigorous interrogations of this specific group. Then a second month passed. The calendar pages turned while a massive federal kidnapping case remained agonizingly stagnant. It took a staggering 60 days for the local authorities to finally begin issuing formal requests to interview the individuals who possessed the exact blueprints of the targeted home. 60 days. 2 full months of absolute silence regarding the most critical persons of interest in the entire county. This is the moment where the narrative fractures and the whispers of a cover-up begin to sound like legitimate questions. How does a police department dealing with a multi-million-dollar digital extortion plot simply forget to question the people who held the keys to the castle? This delay goes far beyond simple incompetence or bureaucratic red tape. It represents a systemic failure so profound that it borders on the surreal. She relied heavily on daily critical medication to survive and depended entirely on a medical pacemaker to keep her heart beating at a steady rhythm. During those crucial 60 days, the individuals who possessed inside knowledge of the property were essentially given a free pass. If any member of that crew was involved in the planning or execution of the raid, they were handed 2 full months to completely sanitize their lives, They had ample time to securely launder the cryptocurrency ransom across international borders. They had time to destroy burner phones, burn physical evidence, and coordinate airtight stories with their accomplices. The delay practically guaranteed that any digital or physical thread connecting them to the masked intruder would be severed and buried forever. This revelation explains the terrifying efficiency of the attacker. The reason the perpetrator knew exactly how to navigate the home and silence the digital alarms without triggering a panic is because the system designed to catch them deliberately looked the other way for 2 months. The investigative void allowed the mastermind to operate with complete impunity. When the police finally decided to ask questions, the trail was not just cold, it was completely frozen over. Her physical ability to fend off a violent attacker was practically non-existent, and her routine was quiet and predictable. The sheer audacity of waiting 60 days to interview the most viable persons of interest forces us to reevaluate the entire command structure of the local department. It forces us to ask whether this was a spectacular display of professional ineptitude or a calculated decision to stall the inquiry. When the guardians of justice fail to execute the most rudimentary steps of an investigation, they create a vacuum where dark rumors thrive. The citizens of the county began to demand answers. They wanted to know who authorized the delay and why the command staff felt no urgency to pursue the most glaring leads in a federal kidnapping case. The 60-day gap is the undeniable peak of this institutional disaster. It is the black hole that swallowed any realistic chance of a swift and successful rescue. If you are as shocked by this catastrophic delay as I am, hit the like button to show your support for holding these broken systems accountable. The failure to act during those 2 months represents a total betrayal of the public trust. It highlights a terrifying reality where the people tasked with solving the most heinous crimes are the ones actively contributing to their unsolvable nature. Yet the environment she inhabited in the weeks leading up to her terrifying disappearance was far from a secluded private fortress. The delayed interrogations transformed an active pursuit into a slow-motion train wreck. By the time the detective sat down with the potential witnesses, the tactical advantage had completely shifted to the perpetrators. The questions asked after 60 days are essentially meaningless because the answers have already been carefully rehearsed and scrubbed of any incriminating details. The mastermind behind this highly coordinated extraction did not just defeat the security systems of a private residence, they defeated the entire law enforcement apparatus simply by waiting them out. The delay was a masterclass in how a local department can unintentionally or perhaps intentionally destroy a case from the inside out, leaving behind nothing but an endless series of unanswerable questions. The inevitable result of a ruined physical environment and a delayed interrogation strategy is a sprawling, agonizing dead end. Today, the investigation into this meticulously planned abduction sits in a state of suffocating paralysis. There are no suspects currently sitting in a holding cell. It was a space teeming with unknown variables. There are no grand jury indictments waiting to be unsealed by a confident prosecutor. The local command center that once buzzed with frantic energy has long since been dismantled, leaving behind only the hollow echoes of a deeply flawed operation. The sprawling federal presence has quietly scaled back, moving their resources to cases where the local groundwork was actually laid properly. The silence surrounding the case is now absolute and terrifying. For the family trapped in this unending nightmare, the lack of resolution is a unique form of psychological torture. They are forced to wake up every single day knowing that the individuals who orchestrated this multi-million-dollar extortion plot are freely walking the streets. They must live with the excruciating reality that the initial response by the people sworn to protect their community was disastrously inadequate. The pain of the unknown is compounded by the glaring procedural errors that allowed the perpetrators to simply slip away into the digital ether. The community itself has been permanently altered by the sheer lack of accountability. The quiet neighborhoods no longer feel secure. Residents look at the local cruisers patrolling their streets and wonder if the officers inside possess the basic competence required to handle a real emergency. The house was essentially a revolving door of temporary laborers. The dark rumors that began as quiet whispers have now solidified into a deep-seated cynicism. The question of whether the botched response was driven by gross negligence or a deliberate attempt to protect someone within the local hierarchy remains the central point of contention. When a law enforcement agency refuses to transparently address a 60-day delay in a federal kidnapping investigation, they invite the public to assume the absolute worst. The lingering unease is rooted in the fact that the architecture of this crime remains a total mystery. We still do not know if the massive cryptocurrency demand was ever successfully transferred or if it was merely a sophisticated distraction to cover a more personal motive. The identity of the heavily armed phantom who bypassed the security cameras remains hidden behind a heavy ski mask and a wall of encryption. The case is technically open, but practically it is frozen in time. The detectives are left sifting through an ocean of stale digital data, hoping for a miraculous break that they failed to manufacture during the critical early days. Are we looking at the absolute pinnacle of investigative incompetence? Or are we witnessing a perfectly orchestrated cover-up designed to protect someone on the inside? According to multiple reports, a crew of private contractors had been working at the residence for an extended period. The story has faded from the national headlines, replaced by the next sensational tragedy, but the void left behind in this specific county is massive. The empty house stands as a grim monument to a series of cascading institutional failures. The true tragedy is that this outcome was not inevitable. The destruction of the case was a direct result of human decisions made by individuals wearing command stars. They chose to let the perimeter fail. They chose to wait 2 months to ask the most important questions. And because of those choices, a predator remains entirely unaccountable. The justice system here did not just fail to catch a criminal, it actively participated in the demise of its own investigation. As the months continue to roll by, the hope for a sudden dramatic arrest slowly evaporates. The community is left grappling with the terrifying realization that if you plan your crime well enough, and if the local authorities stumble hard enough, you can simply vanish without a trace. This meant that a steady stream of individuals who did not live there had intimate and unrestricted access to the complete floor plan. The lingering question that haunts the entire narrative is who truly benefits from this level of investigative paralysis. When the system breaks down so completely, the only victors are the architects of the crime. The victim's family is left holding nothing but the shattered pieces of a botched inquiry. The absence of closure is a heavy burden to bear, especially when that absence was forged by the very institutions designed to provide answers. The shadow of the masked intruder still looms large over the entire town, an ever-present reminder of the night the system failed. What this case teaches us about systemic accountability is profoundly disturbing and demands a rigorous critical analysis. The complete collapse of this investigation serves as a textbook example of how the legal concept of the chain of custody dictates the absolute viability of a criminal prosecution. The chain of custody is not merely a bureaucratic checklist. It is the unbroken, verifiable timeline of evidence handling from the moment of discovery to the presentation in a courtroom. They knew exactly where the heavy exterior doors were located. When a local agency permits unauthorized personnel to cross an active forensic boundary, they sever that chain instantly. This fatal error introduces the legal doctrine of reasonable doubt. In the American judicial framework, a defense attorney does not need to prove their client is innocent. They only need to prove that the evidence handling was flawed enough to cast doubt on its origin. A contaminated perimeter provides that doubt on a silver platter, effectively neutralizing the ability to secure a conviction regardless of any subsequent discoveries. Furthermore, this tragedy exposes the perilous lack of external oversight during the initial phases of high-stakes local investigations. When a police department is allowed to self-monitor its own glaring delays, such as waiting 2 months to conduct critical witness interviews, transparency vanishes. The resulting investigative void protects the perpetrators and disenfranchises the victims. This case is not just an isolated tragedy. It is a glaring indictment of the unchecked procedural autonomy granted to local jurisdictions. They knew the layout of the interior hallways and the specific locations of the bedrooms. It highlights the urgent necessity for immediate independent federal intervention whenever a crime scene involves highly complex digital extortion and severe operational failures. The protection of the physical and operational integrity of an investigation must outweigh local jurisdictional pride. Without stringent independent audits of real-time law enforcement decisions, the public trust is eroded and predators are granted the systemic cover they need to operate freely. The terrifying reality of this case is that the truth remains buried under layers of institutional failure and unanswered questions. The individuals responsible for orchestrating this flawless extraction are still out there completely unbothered by a justice system that tripped over its own feet. The dark rumors surrounding the local command structure will continue to fester until someone is finally held accountable for the catastrophic decisions made during those critical early days. Will a renewed push from federal agencies eventually break through the delays and uncover the mastermind, or will this abduction permanently remain a masterclass in how to exploit a broken police department? The file is still open, and we are watching every single move they make. More importantly, they had ample opportunity to observe her daily habits and clearly recognize her severe physical limitations. If you want to follow the money trail and demand real transparency in these botched investigations, make sure you subscribe to Seth Crime Stories. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss our next deep dive into the shadows of the justice system. The system relies on our silence, but we will not stop asking the hard questions. Stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next case. The fight for justice never ends, even when the authorities give up. The presence of these contractors introduces a layer of tension that simply cannot be ignored in a high-stakes true crime investigation. A private home is supposed to be the ultimate safe haven, especially for someone whose health is incredibly fragile and dependent on electronic medical devices. But when relative strangers are constantly walking through the personal living spaces, the critical boundary between public exposure and private security completely dissolves. Every person wielding a hammer or inspecting a drywall seam is a potential observer who might be gathering crucial intelligence, whether they are doing it intentionally for a sinister purpose or just by casual accident. On February 1st, 2026, an elderly woman simply vanished from her seemingly secure home. Nancy was physically surrounded by people during the day, yet profoundly isolated in her overall vulnerability. She naturally trusted that the people hired to work inside her home were reliable professionals just doing their assigned jobs. She trusted the sturdy locks on her heavy wooden doors and the digital cameras mounted on her front porch. But the simple, mundane act of hiring outside help had unknowingly compromised her entire security perimeter. The contractors had unrestricted views of her daily medical routines and her exact electronic security setup. They saw when she was most exhausted and when she was most alert. This is absolutely not to say that every contractor is inherently dangerous or prone to criminal behavior. But the sheer volume of unfamiliar faces moving through the private residence of an elderly woman creates an environment that is incredibly ripe for malicious exploitation. Someone could easily slip a small window lock into the open position while pretending to paint a wooden seal. Someone could mentally memorize the precise blind spots of the outdoor security cameras while carrying out trash and construction debris. She was not taken in a frantic struggle or a random act of street violence. She was surgically extracted. The vulnerability was not just physical, it was deeply structural. The daily influx of workers essentially turned a quiet suburban residence into a public thoroughfare, which perfectly masked any malicious reconnaissance as ordinary physical labor. As the sun set on the final day of January, the house finally quieted down. The heavy tools were put away and the exterior doors were securely locked. But a deep, lingering unease remained trapped inside those empty rooms. The structural integrity of her personal safe space had been thoroughly compromised long before the sun ever went down. The invisible protective walls surrounding an 84-year-old woman had been slowly dismantled from the inside out, leaving her completely exposed to whoever was patiently watching from the dark. The shattering of that illusion of safety became apparent on the afternoon of February 1st. The day was supposed to follow the same predictable Sunday rhythm she had established over countless years. But the most chilling part of this ongoing nightmare did not happen in the dark. But by noon, her family realized a glaring anomaly. She had not attended her regular church services. For a woman of her advanced age and strict habits, missing a Sunday service without a single explanatory phone call was the absolute equivalent of a massive distress flare lighting up the sky. It signaled immediately that something was fundamentally wrong. Relatives quickly drove to the Catalina Foothills residence to check on her well-being. They likely expected to find her asleep in a chair, or perhaps feeling slightly unwell and unable to reach the telephone. Instead, they found a house that was unsettlingly still and completely devoid of life. The realization that she was missing triggered an immediate panic. The local authorities were called to the scene, and the Pima County Sheriff Department officially took over the property. It happened under the bright lights of an active law enforcement perimeter. As deputies stepped into the residence, they were met with a scene that completely defied standard criminal logic. When a violent home invasion occurs, there is almost always a chaotic physical struggle. You expect to find shattered glass, overturned furniture, and the frantic, messy signs of a victim fighting for their life. You expect to see drawers ripped open and valuables hastily shoved into bags by a panicked burglar looking for a quick score. But the interior of this house painted a vastly different and far more sinister picture. There was no widespread destruction. There was no chaotic mess left behind by a desperate thief. The physical space remained largely intact, suggesting a terrifyingly controlled environment. This was not a random burglary that suddenly went off the rails when the homeowner woke up. This was a highly calculated extraction operation executed with chilling precision. The absence of a massive struggle inside the home meant the intruder knew exactly how to. According to reports from the Hindustan Times, a crucial forensic zone established to track down ruthless digital extortionists was casually breached by a fast food delivery driver. Subdue a fragile 84-year-old woman without turning the house into a war zone. The initial assessment by the police pointed to a reality that no family ever wants to face. Someone had arrived at that property with a specific, singular target in mind. They did not want television sets or loose jewelry. They wanted her. The swiftness and cleanliness of the extraction meant that the perpetrator possessed an unnatural familiarity with the specific layout of the home. They knew exactly how to navigate the hallways in the pitch black of night. They knew exactly where to find her. The local deputies began taping off the perimeter, realizing they were no longer dealing with a simple missing persons report or a confused senior citizen who had wandered off into the neighborhood. They were standing at ground zero of a major felony abduction. The transition from a quiet Sunday welfare check to an active kidnapping investigation was violent and jarring. A local worker carrying a cardboard box was reportedly allowed to walk right past the neighborhood that prided itself on safety and seclusion was suddenly transformed into a frantic grid of flashing police lights and heavy crime scene tape. Investigators began knocking on the doors of confused neighbors, searching desperately for anyone who might have seen a suspicious vehicle or heard a strange noise during the early morning hours. But the initial sweep yielded absolutely nothing of substance. The perpetrator had managed to slip into the residence, secure the victim, and vanish into the cold air without triggering a single neighborhood alarm or waking a single witness. The sheer competence of the crime was staggering. It left the local authorities grasping at thin air. They were hunting a ghost who had seemingly defied the laws of physical security. As the hours ticked by, the agonizing reality of her medical condition weighed heavily on everyone involved.